Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving deep into how globalization is affecting the business world today.
Yeah, globalization, it's a term we hear all the time.
Right, it can feel like one of those buzzwords that gets thrown around a lot. Like we kind of get the general idea, but
Exactly. Like we think we know what it means, but when you actually start to dig into
it
it.
can get a lot more complex.
Right.
So that's exactly what we're going to do today, right? We've got 3 academic papers all about the future of globalization and what it means for businesses.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, you hear that and you think, okay, globalization, the world's one big market. But these papers actually show that's not the whole picture.
Okay, so there's more to it than just like borders are disappearing, everyone's doing business everywhere. So where do we even start? How are these sources defining globalization? Why does it even matter if you're trying to make sense of the business world?
Well, they all agree that it's about this shift towards a much more integrated and interdependent global economy. But they also talk about this concept of deglobalization.
Wait, deglobalization. So as the world gets more connected, some forces are pulling it apart. What does that even look like practically?
Well, think about the trade wars we've seen in recent years. Countries slapping tariffs on each other, trying to protect their own industries.
Oh, yeah.
Or the push for more regional supply chains after all the chaos with COVID. These are signs that globalization isn't always a one-way street.
Right, so it's not just this steady march towards a borderless world.
Nope, not at all.
That makes it even more important to understand those forces, right? Like what's driving globalization in the first place?
2 big things jump out from these papers. Reducing trade barriers, which lets companies see the whole world as their market, and of course the explosion of technology.
Technology, that one always comes up, but sometimes it feels a bit abstract,
Yeah?
How has technology actually changed the game for businesses?
Okay, try to imagine running a global business before the internet or cheap microchips. It would have been crazy expensive and difficult to communicate, process information, and move things around.
Yeah, I mean, just the cost of a phone call back in the day.
Right. Now you can order something online from across the world and have it on your doorstep in like 2 days. That ease of doing business globally, that's huge.
Okay, so technology is the great enabler, right? It brings down those barriers, makes the world feel smaller. But we've also got these forces pushing in different directions, like you said, with deglobalization. So what trends are these sources highlighting as we look at how global business has actually been changing?
They point to some big shifts, and they go all the way back to the 1960s, like the decline of the USA as the sole economic superpower. You've got the rise of developing nations, not just as sources of cheap labor, but as economic powerhouses in their own right.
Okay, so that's going to be a huge change for companies used to the old way of doing things. Is there a way to kind of measure how dramatic this shift really is?
One of the papers predicts that by 2025, developing nations will be responsible for over 60% of the world's economic activity.
Wow.
That's not just a trend, it's a seismic shift. And it's not just output either. Foreign direct investment, the money flowing into businesses, is increasingly directed towards these developing economies.
Okay, so we see where the money's going, but how does that change the types of companies operating on a global scale? Are we still just talking about the same old multinational giants?
Not really. While those traditional multinational enterprises, or M&Es for short, based in the U.S., are less dominant, we're seeing the rise of M&Es from other developed countries and even developing nations. But what's even more interesting is the rise of mini multinationals.
You need multinationals.
Yeah, smaller companies empowered by technology to compete globally.
So the barrier to entry for global business is lower than ever. Do they give any real-world examples of these mini multinationals shaking things up?
Well, one example is Lenovo, the Chinese computer company. They acquired IBM's PC division back in 2004.
Oh.
That's a classic example of a mini multinational making a major play on the global stage, using technology and this globalized market to take on a giant.
And that all ties into the changing world order, right? The fall of the Soviet Union, China's meteoric rise, India becoming this tech hub, Latin America stepping up. What does all of this mean for businesses?
It means companies need to understand that the global power dynamics are shifting. You've got the collapse of Russian communism, the rise of these new players. It creates opportunities, sure, but also challenges. Some of these rising economies are moving towards more state-controlled systems, which has big implications for how businesses operate.
Right, so it's not just about finding cheap labor or new customers anymore. It's about understanding a whole different set of rules, potentially a different way of thinking about business altogether. But of course, globalization isn't without its critics. These sources dive into that whole debate too, right?
Absolutely. They highlight all the main arguments for and against globalization, and it's important to understand both sides.
Okay, so let's get into it. What are some of the big criticisms these sources bring up? I'd imagine jobs and wages have got to be a big one.
Definitely. Critics are worried about job losses in developed countries as companies move manufacturing to countries with lower wages. They argue it leads to this race to the bottom where companies exploit workers in developing countries to make more profit. And on the other side, supporters argue that this specialization actually leads to greater efficiency, and that means lower prices for consumers.
It's interesting how both sides can look at the same thing and come to such different conclusions.
Yeah.
What about labor standards and the environment? That's another big concern people have.
Right. Critics worry about companies taking advantage of weaker regulations in developing countries to cut corners, which can lead to environmental damage and worker exploitation. But supporters say that globalization actually encourages countries to raise their standards, especially when it's tied to trade agreements. The idea being that countries will want to meet those standards so they can attract foreign investment and participate in global trade.
So globalization could actually be a force for good in that sense, if it's done right.
Potentially, yeah.
But what about those global institutions? Don't people worry about them having too much power?
Yes, critics are wary of organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, gaining too much power and taking away power from national governments. But supporters argue that these organizations only have the power that member countries give them, and their purpose is to promote shared interests and fair trade practices.
Okay, so it's less about them being powerful in themselves and more about how much power countries choose to hand over.
Exactly.
What about inequality? I feel like globalization always gets blamed for the gap between the rich and the poor.
That's a key issue. Critics point to statistics like the one from Oxfam, which says the richest 1% owns more than the rest of the world combined. They argue that globalization helps wealthy individuals and corporations benefit the most, making global inequality worse. Supporters, though, say this gap is more about national policies and inequality within countries, not globalization itself. They say that globalization can actually lift people out of poverty by creating new opportunities in developing countries.
Okay, so some pretty strong arguments on both sides there. But even with all this talk of interconnectedness, does geography still matter in this globalized world? Are those barriers really dissolving?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. These papers offer two different perspectives on that. You've got Thomas Friedman. He's like the ultimate hyper-globalist. He believes globalization is just speeding up and making the world flatter and flatter, all thanks to technology.
So like we're all becoming part of this one giant system?
Yeah, he talks about 10 flatteners, these forces pushing us towards being more alike. Things like the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the internet, outsourcing global supply chains.
But surely it can't be that simple. Are there any counterpoints to that view in these sources?
Oh, yeah. Pankaj Ghemawat has this idea of semi-globalization. He thinks companies overestimate how easy it is to do business abroad.
So he's saying it's not as simple as just setting up shop anywhere you want.
Right. He thinks distance, whether it's cultural, administrative, geographical, or economic, still matters a lot. He uses this acronym, CAGE.
CAGE.
Yeah, it stands for those 4 types of distance that can impact a company's success in a foreign market: cultural, administrative, geographical, and economic.
Okay, so even with technology breaking down barriers, the world isn't quite as flat as some people think.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example of how these distances might actually play out in the real world?
Think about Coca-Cola. They tried to replace Inca Cola in Peru, but it totally backfired. Yeah. Even with all their money and brand recognition, they couldn't overcome the cultural attachment Peruvians had to their local drink.
Wow, that's a great illustration of how cultural differences can still make or break a company, even a giant like Coca-Cola.
Exactly. And that's just one example of the complexities companies face in this globalized world.
So we've got all these forces at play, this push and pull between interconnectedness and distance, and it's changing all the time. What does it all mean for companies trying to make sense of this crazy landscape?
Well, that's what we'll get into in the next part of our deep dive. These papers have some really valuable insights into how companies can leverage globalization, but also how they can navigate all those complexities.
Sounds good to me. Stay tuned as we break down those trends and what they mean for you. Okay, so we've talked about how globalization is this constantly changing thing, but how can companies actually use it to their advantage?
Well, one of the papers brings up how falling transportation costs have opened up all these opportunities, you know? Like, think about Ecuador. They're now a major global supplier of roses. Yeah. Before, shipping flowers that far would have been way too expensive, but now they've found this niche in the global market.
That's a cool example. So it's not just about finding new customers, right? Globalization lets companies tap into global talent pools, get cheaper raw materials, even relocate parts of their operations to places where it makes more financial sense.
Right, exactly.
But it's not all sunshine and roses, is it? What are some of the downsides, things companies need to be careful about?
Well, the papers emphasize that globalization is a double-edged sword. Lots of opportunities, but also lots of complexities and risks. Managing international operations can be a real headache. You've got different legal systems, different cultures, fluctuating exchange rates. It can all throw a wrench in your plans.
Sounds like companies need to be super adaptable these days.
Yeah, definitely.
What can they do to manage those risks and make sure they're making smart decisions?
One paper suggests they need to get really good at understanding and managing risk. So it's not just about expanding into new markets. It's about doing your research first, seeing what the potential problems might be, and having backup plans.
Oh, yeah. Like what happens if your supply chain gets disrupted or there's some unexpected political change?
Exactly. Or even just currency fluctuations. Those could have a huge impact on your profits.
So it's like companies need a global early warning system, always looking out for potential problems.
That's a good way to put it.
Anything else companies should be thinking about as they navigate this globalized world?
Cultural intelligence is super important. Even with technology and the internet, cultural differences haven't gone away. You can't just assume that what works in one country will work somewhere else.
It's about understanding those differences, adapting to different cultural contexts.
Yeah, exactly.
But haven't we been hearing more and more about deglobalization lately? What does that even look like in practice?
Well, one trend the papers point to is the rise of these regional blocs. Instead of going fully global, some companies are focusing on strengthening their presence in specific regions, taking advantage of existing trade agreements and cultural similarities.
That makes sense. It's a more focused approach to globalization.
Yeah, it's more strategic.
And we're also seeing more localized supply chains, right?
Definitely. The pandemic really showed how vulnerable those long, complex global supply chains can be. So companies are now looking to source materials and products closer to home, relying less on suppliers that are far away.
Right. So it's like a shift from global sourcing to regional sourcing or even domestic sourcing.
Exactly.
Is there any evidence that this is actually happening?
There is. One of the sources mentions that by 2021, most trade in Asia and Europe was intra-regional. So it was happening within those regions, not across continents.
Okay, so that's a pretty strong sign that things might be changing.
Yeah, it suggests that globalization might be slowing down, becoming more regionalized.
So is this a complete reversal of globalization, or is it more like globalization just evolving and taking on new forms?
That's a tough question, and a lot of people are trying to figure it out. There are good arguments on both sides. Some people think the forces driving globalization are just too powerful to be stopped completely. They point to things like how interconnected the global financial system is, how important international trade still is.
So even if supply chains become more regional, the world's still linked together financially.
Right. It's a complex situation.
How do companies deal with these seemingly contradictory trends?
They need to be flexible, ready to adapt as the global landscape changes. Think globally, act regionally.
Makes sense. The papers also talk about slowbalization. What is that exactly?
Slowbalization is basically the slowing down or even partial reversal of those globalization trends. It's not necessarily a complete stop, but a shift towards more regional or local approaches.
And what's driving this?
Well, things like the rise of protectionism, concerns about national security, making sure countries can take care of themselves, and even a growing awareness of the environmental impact of shipping things all over the world.
So we might be headed towards a world where there's less free movement of goods and capital and more regional agreements and local supply chains.
It's a real possibility.
It also sounds a lot more unpredictable. How can companies even plan for that?
Strategic thinking and flexibility are key. Companies need to constantly be scanning the environment, identifying potential risks and opportunities, and being ready to change their strategies as needed.
So basically, they can't afford to be complacent.
Nope. The rules of the game are changing, and they need to change with them.
That's a lot to take in, but these papers really give us a good framework for understanding this complex world.
Yeah, they do.
And it's not just relevant for big companies, right? These trends affect businesses of all sizes.
Absolutely.
So what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they make decisions about their businesses?
I think the most important thing is that globalization is not static. It's dynamic. It's constantly in flux. If you treat it like it's some fixed thing, you're going to be caught off guard.
So don't assume the world's just going to keep getting flatter and flatter.
Exactly. Be adaptable, stay informed, and be willing to question your assumptions about how the world works.
Great advice. It's a lot to process, but hopefully this deep dive has given our listeners a clearer picture of what's going on and what they can do to stay ahead of the curve.
I hope so. And I hope they leave this conversation not just with knowledge, but with a sense of curiosity, that drive to keep exploring these questions as things unfold.
Because this story's not over yet?
Nope, not by a long shot.
We're all still figuring this out as we go.
Exactly.
It's been quite a journey exploring how globalization has evolved over time and where it might be headed.
Yeah, it really has. And these papers don't just give us answers. They highlight some of the big open questions businesses are facing right now.
Like what? What's the big question mark hanging over all of this?
I think it's the future of globalization. Is it here to stay, or is this just a temporary blip?
Right. Are we going to see these regional trade blocs become even more powerful? Could global supply chains unravel completely, or will they just become shorter and more focused?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and nobody has a definitive answer. But the key is to understand the different forces at play, the possible scenarios. That's how businesses can make smart decisions, even with all this uncertainty.
So it's less about predicting the future perfectly and more about being ready for anything.
Exactly. These papers aren't crystal balls, but they do give us some tools to think about the future.
So as we wrap up, what's the one big takeaway our listeners should remember about globalization and its impact on business?
I'd say the most important thing is that globalization is not a straight line. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and it's always changing. If you think you've got it all figured out, you're probably wrong.
So ditch those old assumptions about the world getting flatter and flatter.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Businesses need to be flexible, stay informed, and be willing to question everything they think they know about how the world works.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into globalization. We hope it's given you a clearer picture of what's happening and what you can do to navigate this complex landscape.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating topic, and it's one that's going to keep evolving. Stay curious.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries. See you next time.